What is up, Felix Lehr here for Thomann Synthesizers, and today we are going back to the roots because I'm about to explore Detroit Techno. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, of course there's the first generation of artists, including people like Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson and Derek May, but I'm personally more inspired by the second wave of artists, including people like Robert Hood and Jeff Mills, which is where I'm going to draw my inspiration from today. But there's the problem now that this whole genre is so complex and diverse that it's pretty much impossible to create the one exemplary Detroit techno track. But what I'm going to try to do is to cover what I deem to be the two most important archetypes. So on the one hand, I'm going to create one of the more dissonant, abstract and aggressive kind of machine funk tracks. And then on the other hand, I'm going to try to create one of these more soulful, melodic, deep techno tracks that also work with conventional harmony. And yeah, I'm going to create the first one with a lot of fancy gear, and then to prove a point, I'm going to try to create the other track with only the built-in Ableton sound sources, because I want to convince you that no matter what budget you are on, you can actually start expressing yourself through this beautiful genre today. So why don't we go ahead and start with a little live jam and see how it goes. Alright, why don't we go ahead and have a little look at what exactly I did here. The centerpiece is of course the Roland TR-8 S, which is basically the best all-around solution for all of the classic Roland sounds. In this case I'm only using the 909 kit. There's obviously 808, 606, 707, all of them in here. But for a Detroit Techno, I think if you had to choose one kit, it would be the 909 kit. Close second is the 808 kit, of course. And as you might see, I'm actually running all of the individual outputs from the individual sounds into my MKII 1604 analog mixing desk. These are actually super cheap. I bought this one for $100 I think on eBay a couple of years ago. But what this allows me to do is to actually overdrive all of the sounds individually through the built-in preamp. So for example, I can saturate the kick like this and the snare on another channel is also being overdriven, but by a different amount. And if you do this for all of the sounds individually, you have a much more gritty, much more warm sound. But you can also recreate this digitally, and I'm actually about to show you exactly how I do it later in my Ableton project. Anyways, moving on. The Octatrack is basically just a clock, and it has this breakbeat sample here, or two of them actually. This one is a tiny breakbeat clip, little attack with a bit of noise in it. And I put it on top of the kick, and this way the kick I think sounds much more interesting. It's a little pluckier attack, but it also gives texture to everything, and this way, yeah, it just sounds warmer and more organic. Up next, this breakbeat here, actually sampled on a super, this is the actual breakbeat. Yeah, but I let it loop really, really fast, so I'm basically using it as a shaker or hi-hat or whatever. And this also adds to the groove, makes it more human, more organic, more natural, more funky. Exactly, that's it for the rhythm section, I guess. And for the main sequence, I'm using the Buchla Easel command, which is a great synth for abstract kind of sounds. This particular design is actually from the 70s, and I think it still sounds so futuristic. It's insane. Anyways, this is not necessary. It's just a lot of fun and great for explaining some basic concepts to you. The special thing that makes this sequence interesting is that, as you can see here, this is our sequencer where we create the notes. These notes are not quantized. You're dialing them in all by ear, meaning that you're gonna create harmony that has never been heard of before and will probably never be heard again. Because these are not the typical notes that you find on a keyboard. Anyways, you can do this in a whole bunch of Eurorack gear as well. If you want this exact layout, there's actually even a Arturia Music Easel VST, which has all of these exact same controls. And these ideas, of course, yeah, like unquantized pitch, you can just work with these ideas and see what kind of gear you can get where you can yeah, do the same thing. And then lastly, the Waldorf Pulse 2 has this super high voltage kind of sound. I use this to build up additional tension in the end for the last break. And yeah, it's just one oscillator playing a really high note. Every 16th step actually here on the Octatrack it's being sequenced. And yeah, it's just an abstract kind of sound with a lot of resonance. And yeah, that's it for the sounds. And then for the performance part, I guess, as you noticed, the TR-8 S was the most important thing, and you can actually perform with this thing really nice. And if you capture it like this, there's also going to be much more of a performative human feel in your recording as opposed to working with samples. But depending on the kind of production that you want to create, one or the other might be preferable. Anyways, let's jump into Ableton to see how we could go about creating a Detroit-style techno track with 0 gear whatsoever and with only Ableton's built-in sound sources. Alright, welcome inside of my Ableton. I actually already prepared all of the sounds here, so I'm first going to play through them, and then I'm basically going to go through each individual sound and the processing and the rationale behind it. And hopefully there's some useful information buried within that. So let's start by having a listen. I guess you get the idea. These are our basic sounds, and as opposed to the first track, you might have already noticed that this is all a lot more melodic and harmonious because we are actually working within the regular 12-tone equal temperament. Here, let's start with the pad, which is just 2 chords basically. You can see them here and hear them as well. And I created them with Ableton's stock analog synth. Let me remove all of the processing first and start with the first oscillator here. There's not much going on here. We have a slight bit of filter envelope, as you can hear. If I remove the filter, it's very harsh. So yeah, we have that going for it. Then, which is super important, I think, is the noise, because this actually makes the sound vintage and analog and warm. And then we have a second oscillator, which is detuned a bit. And now, wait for the A-B comparison. You can see that I detuned the oscillator here. This way it's perfectly in tune and it's boring, but this way it's imperfect and it's starting to flutter and move and be unpredictable. And I think that's where this sound gets its character from. Then we have a slight bit of vibrato here going on as well. And all of these are functions that you have on basically any software synth and any poly synth. And yeah, super basic patch. One of the oscillators is a saw wave here and the other one is a square wave. And up next, this is actually a plugin like some other that I'm using here that's not from Ableton, but I said sound sources, not sound processing, only stock Ableton. This is Radiator by Soundtoys, and what this does is it models a preamp, like a vintage analog preamp, where you would record into a desk through one of these. So this is basically a subtle form of saturation, and this one actually also introduces noise. Yeah, almost like a tape hiss, it sounds a bit. If I can do the A-B here. Yeah, which also glues everything together. If there's just a bit of noise in your mix, that helps to fill out the space. And yeah, I'm using this one actually on every single sound in this whole project. On every sound there's a radiator. Because I'm doing effectively what I did in the MKII, just that this plugin actually, I think, sounds even a bit better. If you would buy any external VST suite, I would recommend to actually get your hands on the Soundtoys plugins, because they all sound amazing. They all sound super warm and analog. I actually even had a recording recently of a analog synth through an analog filter, through the analog heat, I think, and it still sounded somewhat digital in my computer. And then I put on one of the digital Soundtoys VSTs, and then suddenly it sounded analog. So yeah, Soundtoys, complete recommendation, but wait for it until it's on sale, because they are usually expensive, but every couple of months they are like half the price. Yeah, that's on every sound in here. Then let's go on. I have here the echo from Ableton, built-in modeling like a old school tape echo. And what this has, it's a beautiful feature here called wobble. It's subtle, so put your headphones on. This is without wobble. And now let me exaggerate the wobble. This is the behavior of a very messed up tape delay, basically. But we have it in a very subtle way. It's effectively pitch modulation, and it also adds a form of instability, and that's just like this kind of vintage aesthetic, and then also a tiny bit of noise. This lets you add to the sound as well. And yeah, that's one of the many tiny little steps that all do a very small difference, but if you do a lot of these steps, you're actually going to end up with a lot warmer sound. And unpredictable pitch modulation is typical vintage behavior of oscillators that can't quite stay in tune, or old tape delays. So you just have to understand why stuff sounds warm and analog and vintage, and if you understand why, you can easily recreate it with plugins. All right, up next, just an EQ. And what I'm doing here, you can actually, on the Ableton EQ and on many others as well, go in here and either adjust the entire EQ, or you can spread it out into the mid and side EQ. So this is my EQ curve for the middle of the signal, for the mono part, and then this is for the sides of the stereo image. And there you usually don't want a lot of bass going on, so that's why I removed it here. All right, up next, a little compression, and this actually does some sidechain with the bass. So if I now start playing the bass, which we're not going to hear, we're going to hear, however, the sidechain compression. So the bass is going to move the pad out of the way. And this wasn't so much functional as like aesthetic or groove oriented in my case, this decision, because I just wanted to have the sounds interact with each other. And sidechain compression is the most obvious way to have one sound interact with another sound. Which is also why here are these two stems that you can see. One of them is a ghost hi-hat and the other one is a ghost kick. So we never ever hear these in the actual track, but they are always playing in the background because we can grab these as sidechain signals. So for example, for the bass, I think, which is also done with analog, there's also a sidechain compression, and this one is grabbing the signal from the ghost kick. So even if this kick that we are hearing here is out during the break, the bass will still be sidechained by the ghost kick, because otherwise it would often sound jarring when the sidechain compression suddenly stops. Let's see. What else do we have here on the pad? An auto pen, which basically just makes the pad move very subtly, very slowly from left to right. And then up next, also from Soundtoys, Decapitator, which is the best saturation distortion plugin I've ever heard. I also have this on almost every single track because analog equipment, where you would run something through, it would always in some way color and distort and saturate sound, even if you don't intend on it, but it's just a side product of analog equipment. So I try to simulate that on every single track basically, and it takes a lot of processing power, but it's worth it. And lastly, here's an LFO. What is this modulating? Yeah, it's modulating the cutoff of the filter, so that the pad is just a bit more in movement and also unsynchronized with BPM. All right, next sound, the melody. Obviously works a lot better with the pad in harmony and the bass. Yeah, it's also just the analog built-in synth called analog here in Ableton. And it's also super basic patch. One oscillator is a saw, the other one is also a saw. Oh, I could actually detune this a bit. Wow, now it's even more interesting. Yeah, but I think I prefer it like this. Yeah, let's go over the processing. Pretty much the same as always, radiator at first. Then with the amp, I'm adding some sharpness and some presence in the high frequencies, as you can hear. LFO is modulating the cutoff as well, just to get some movement going in the sound. Then I'm doing the same with the echo, and it's wobble here, as on the pad as well. Micro shift. Also a Soundtoys effect, which is really lovely, but here the effect that it has is really minute. You can hear this is the wet signal, and it's just a stereo signal, very far out here, chorus-like. And I just mixed that in a tiny bit, just to have some stereo width going on here. Then an auto pan, which also just moves the sound around a bit. And then I'm using a plate reverb emulation, also from Soundtoys, because I think if you would use these large, super futuristic, eventide, black hole or Valhalla vintage verb kind of sounds, they would sound too contemporary and too digital. So that's why I'm going for this old school kind of plate sound here. And actually on the Sense, I'm also having a plate reverb by Soundtoys. Yeah, for the same reason, because it sounds more 90s, I guess, than one of these large digital reverbs. Yeah, moving on to the bass. Again, it's just analog, the built-in synth from Ableton. And let's check out how it started. It started like this. This is our pattern. Here are the notes, super basic. Just a simple groovy melody. Maybe let's hear it, bass melody. And as you might notice, here where the kick is, there I don't have any note whatsoever. And here where the other kick is, I have a note that's not so loud, it's a bit shorter, and it doesn't have so much mass, so that it doesn't collide too heavily with the kick. So the longer notes like these, they are between the kicks. So yeah, to just have space for the kick and for the bass individually. And if you're uncertain about it and you can't like turn your monitors up super loud, one easy trick to actually feel the substance of a track is to take your headphones, hold them like this, and feel how the headphone is actually moving. And this should be a clean, groovy movement between the kick and the bass, because this is the exact way in which a room is going to shake. If you play this on a super large sound system in a techno club, this movement is going to be the movement of the whole building, ideally. Yeah, so you better want to know how exactly the bass is moving membranes. And yeah, this is just a tip that works for me, because your ears sometimes deceive you. All right, so let's get back to the processing of the bass here. First, there's obviously just this oscillator saw wave as well. I think the noise is not even audible. It's completely filtered out. And then we have a second oscillator, which is actually 2 octaves higher. And it's a square wave. Yeah, this just makes it cut through more through the pad, for example. Yeah, if we listen to the pad now, when it starts. It's a subtle difference, but without the second oscillator. doesn't cut through as well. And yeah, then the other processing that I already re-enabled here, radiator as always, amp for higher frequency content, decapitator for further saturation, sidechain compression, here another EQ, just adding even more crunch in the high end, and an oscillator, LFO, it's a low frequency oscillator, that is, yeah, just making the frequency here, as you can see, move a tiny bit always, so that it never perfectly repeats. Also just adding a bit of randomness and unpredictability, even if it's just on a super tiny little scale. If you do 20, 30, 50 moves like this in a track, it's gonna feel organic, whereas if you don't, it's not, at least not in a digital context. Alright, maybe let's move on to this second layer, which I created here. It's the bass line basically just copied, but I added a bit crush on top, which in Ableton is called Redux, and you can dial in the exact frequency of the bit crush. And I choose the, I think it's either the root note or the fifth of the root note of the scale in which we are working. Yeah, just to make sure, because I wanted the track to be harmonious. So what I actually also did when I started out with the kick, and I saw the kick is an A sharp. So I said, all right, A sharp is our root note. So I'm composing this entire track in A sharp minor because I want it to be melancholic and a bit sad. So yeah, that's how I started out. That's why the bass line and the pad and the melody are all in this scale. Alright, lastly, let's have a look on the rest of the processing of the 909 here. I think it's going to be very similar on all of the sounds. There's a radiator on every single sound. Some EQ. Yeah, for example, I don't need any low frequencies in the closed hi-hat, but I want to boost the higher frequencies. Up next, yeah, I think the tom has a lot of decapitator and radiator as well. Same for the clap, which I think also has some compression on it. Yeah, and the clap also has some modulation going on. As you can see here with the LFO, I am modulating the release, just so that not all of the claps have the exact same length, which also just adds some unpredictability, some movement. And this is something that you would usually record manually with a drum machine, but here is no drum machine, there's no performance. Could obviously do that with MIDI controllers, but here I'm just simulating it with an LFO. And then what else do we have? Maybe the ride is still interesting. Let's have a listen at the ride, which also has a nice harmony with the melodic elements of the track. Yeah, there's some sidechain compression going on with the ghost kick, which is pretty heavy actually. And then we have some EQ, also making it sharper in the higher end here. And some auto panning, because if you listen, you will notice that it's moving a slight bit all the time. And then what's most important here is the LFO, I think, because as you can see, the LFO is modulating the tuning of the ride, which is something that you would often do manually on a 909, that you would tune the ride up and down in sort of this fashion. So I just have an LFO, which is doing it for me all the time. Also, yeah, just to have some movement in here. And I think that's it already. And then, yeah, what I didn't use here in this track is a breakbeat. But if you were to use breakbeats, or if you're looking for breakbeats, the number one sample pack that you should probably be aware of is called something like Jungle 1989 to 99 or something like this. You have to Google it, or Jungle, something like this. It's like the #1 sample pack that all the UK producers, they're all using it. And once you download this sample pack, a whole lot of dance music is gonna make a whole lot more sense to you because it's all right there. And in case you are using breakbeats not in a sampler but in a DAW, I can recommend, at least if you want to recreate the vintage classic breakbeat style that you are used to actually take the audio samples and put them into your DAW's sampler or into some kind of VST sampler, as opposed to just putting it here in the audio timeline and slicing it there. Because a huge part of the character of the sampling of breakbeats is actually that there's individual slices which each have a sequenced impact and an own envelope. Yeah, so for example, if you have a tiny slice of a breakbeat, like 2 hits or so, that this actually has an envelope that goes down at the end and that you can control. Because that's going to sound way different from just chopping up breakbeats here in the timeline, where everything has a perfectly straight sustain all the time. So keep that in mind in case you want to recreate the classic breakbeat sounds. All right, I guess that's it for Ableton. And then lastly, in case you want to dig further into this genre of music and see where it's headed contemporarily, I have some record recommendations. Starting out with this one by Tadeo, Chronicles of the Future on Non-Serious, which is a label run by Psych from Madrid. And I think Tadeo is one of the most cutting edge people that really is inspired by this Mills school kind of techno, but in a really contemporary way, and he's really pushing it forward. And he even recently had his first release on Jeff Mills' label Axis Records himself, which is well deserved. Tadeo, check him out. Then up next, you should check out the entire catalog of Token Records, which I think is one of the labels with the best quality standard in all of contemporary techno. And I know that the label owner Chris is also very inspired by Jeff Mills, but also very contemporary stuff and really beautiful continuation of this lineage. And lastly, maybe my #1 favorite techno record of all time, Luke Slater, under his Planetary Soul Systems alias. This guy has been at it for almost 30 years by now, but unlike most of the originators and early pioneers, he's actually kept at it with, I think, the same amount of passion and focus on improving his sound for 30 years. So this is, from a pure technical perspective, maybe the most advanced techno productions that you're going to find, because there's simply no one that I know of who has been perfecting his craft so consistently for that long. So these are my recommendations. Let me know your favorite records in case you have some nice recommendations as well. Alright, I guess that's it from my side for today. Hope this was helpful to some of you. In case you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'll try to get back to you ASAP. And thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Peace out.